Welcome to the Business of Government Hour TV, a video companion to our flagship radio program. I'm Michael Keegan, your host. This is a special edition of the Business of Government Hour on developing the next generation of government leaders with Trevor Brown, Executive Director of the State of Ohio Leadership Institute and Dean of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University. Take a look and take a listen. You can download the entire interview at iTunes or businessofgovernment.org. So, Trevor, would you tell us more about the mission of the State of Ohio Leadership Institute?
It's very simply to develop the next generation of state and local elected leaders in the state of Ohio.
Mm-hmm. When did it start? And more importantly, what prompted its creation?
It's a pretty remarkable guy, the current Speaker of the House in Ohio, a gentleman named Cliff Rosenberger, a very young man, second youngest speaker in the history of Ohio, and at one point in time, the youngest speaker in the country. He's in his mid-30s. And interestingly, was coming to the end of his term and thinking about what kind of impact did he want to have beyond his time in office. And interestingly, he reflected on his own personal circumstances. Here he was, the youngest person in this role in a long, long time, and yet he was going to have to leave. And why was that? It's term limits. And his insight was that term limits had really reduced the ability of the legislature to play its role as a co-equal branch of government. Term limits had ceded power to the executive branch. And interestingly, to lobbyists. They were the enduring institutional memory of the state of Ohio, and not the citizen legislators that term limits were supposed to bring into office, which they did. And so I think in a perfect world, maybe we'd get rid of term limits, but those are constitutionally enshrined now. The state of Ohio embarked on those in the early 1990s, and I don't think there's any great push to get rid of them. And so the next best thing he could envision was creating a resource for that next generation of leaders moving into elected office to prepare them for the magnitude of their roles. So he wanted to place this in a university because he thought that would be an enduring institution that was neutral and a third party and would be respected by that next generation of leaders coming into these elected roles.
So as you're building the institute, what are some of the key leadership programs you're offering?
So we are in the development phase, and the first programming will roll out this summer. The first is a leadership academy. It will be residential on the campus of Ohio State University, taking elected officials out of their day-to-day life. We're going to do it in the summer when it's not the thick of the governing process. The state legislature session will be over then. And the idea is to take them away from the immediate requirements of serving their constituents and get them to reflect beyond campus. Put them in experiences where they're with their peers at the state and local level. It'll be a mix of state and local, and with experts, both academics and practitioners. So one part will be this residential leadership academy. A second part of this is a series of conferences, symposia, bringing thought leaders together to both share lessons learned, but also broadcast out to the broader citizenry about the good work that we're doing. Part 3 will be trying to get young people engaged, a mission that we in higher ed have all the time, but fortunately the speaker saw this as an important build the pipeline, right? And so it's getting high school students and college-age students not just interested in public service, which is, again, a mission we have in the college, but in elective service. This is an era where lots of people who used to think of serving their constituency, it's not on their radar. Perhaps it's the divisiveness of politics. Perhaps it's the intrusion into your personal life that comes with running for office. All those things are still present, but we need young people to be thinking about this as not necessarily a career, but as a part of their public service. And then there's a fourth part that we will develop, which is a series of training modules in key areas, ethics, the budget process, key policy areas, health policy, trying to get resources in front of these decision makers in ways that they can consume it efficiently. Could be in-person training, could be online, could be podcasts, could be a variety of ways to convey information to them.
When you were setting up the mission and the focus of the Institute, you had to have recognized, and I know from our other previous conversations that you do. I'd like to delve into some of the core leadership challenges being faced, particularly at the state and local levels, and maybe beyond Ohio, if you want
sure. And when we say beyond Ohio, sometimes that I'll oversimplify, and every state is different and every situation is different. But as a general rule, I think there are a series of things that are facing state and local officials that are challenging. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, the complexity of government is increasing. It's not decreasing. Part of that's driven by the demands of the citizenry. The history of democratic governance is not to reduce our wants, it's to increase them. We've opened a process where we ask the people what do they want and need, and they ask for more typically. And so, and it's not so much they want to consume more, it's that they want our governments to handle increasingly complex challenges. Safety and security in schools right now is the hot button issue at the state and local level. And while we've boiled it down to gun rights versus mental health issues or whatever it is a tremendously complex equation. Schools were set up initially to provide education. They now provide an array of services, from healthcare for some people to sustenance in the form of food. And now there is a responsibility to keep people safe, which was never an expectation when you and I went to school. We just presumed that it was happen. So the requirements of governance have just gotten more complex, and trying to understand that systemic nature of all these public problems is something that a newly elected official has to get up to speed much quicker. A second is that, and I don't think this is the fault of the actual participants. I think generally the people that run for public office are value-driven. They want to make a difference in the world. At Senator Glenn's funeral a year and a half ago, Vice President Biden was kind enough to come and share some thoughts. And when he was asked to reflect on his sort of tutelage under Senator Glenn was sort of a generation ahead of him. He said, Senator Glenn and other senators of his ilk said, you should always question the position of your opponents, those on the other side of the aisle, but you should never question their motives. They're there for good reasons, right? So I think people come into office as value-driven people, but the incentives right now are to promote divisiveness, right? The way that elections are constructed, whether it's the way that districts are organized and the way that primaries are run, the incentives are to divide rather than to come together. And so a challenge that we face at the state and local level, just as we see here in the nation's capital, is how do we get people to figure out how to compromise? That doesn't mean they have to necessarily forego their value-driven positions, but how do we get them to come together and come up with compromise solutions so we can move forward on some of these challenging issues? That is a phenomenon that occurs across the states and the localities. And it's increasing, right? I mean, the divisiveness of campaigns and the kind of toxicity of our public discourse is not diminishing. It's getting worse. And yet we still have to make decisions that advance our public ends.
Yeah, and I mean, what you're doing I wanted to talk about how the Institute would remedy some of those issues. And it looks to me that they'll provide the tools, the insight for when these folks are elected on how to govern and manage the state the most effectively. Is that kind of where?
Yeah, I think there's a series of approaches. Number one is there are some tools. We'll be partnering with some other organizations that have really done some great work in this. I'd highlight the National Institute for Civil Discourse, a really phenomenal organization that is developing programs for state and local officials to figure out how to operate in a bipartisan fashion, right? And so there are some tools and techniques in compromise and conflict negotiation and listening, and then moving forward to a decision while taking into account the position of the other side. That's part of it, right? Some sort of explicit training in how to negotiate. But there's also some more implicit approaches, namely getting people in a room that disagree with each other and building their personal relationships. So when I talked about the network earlier, this is the long-term goal. And we in universities think long-term. It's not the next election cycle that we're worried about. It's the next generation that we're worried about. And so what we're hoping is not in the first 2 years, but in the first 10 years, that you get a sufficient volume of people through the program who are building personal connections across their divisions, that they learn. It's not so much that they learn how to get along. They already know how to get along, right? Interpersonally, people are really good at this most of the time. But they forget when they walk into their positions. But then if I look across the aisle and say, oh, Michael, I remember we had a beer together, or we went for a walk together and we talked about our families or whatever it is. Then I remember, oh, you're not a Republican or a Democrat. You're just a person who wants to do good in the world. So that'll be a part of this as well. And then a third piece of this will be, as universities have done for generations, and programs in public affairs and administration and public policy are committed to, is making fact-based, objective decisions, right? Gathering information to use that as the basis for why you voted one way or another. Now, you always have to account for the politics of your district or whatever your elected position may be, but you need to balance that with what's the objective information about the circumstances. And I think the pendulum has swung at this moment too far towards the sort of dynamics of the political environment to the neglect of what we think of as fact-based objective analysis. And one of our jobs is to try and move that pendulum, not all the way back, but towards how do we balance these factors.
You've worked with the center. You've done research reports on very practical, public management issues.
Yeah, been proud to be a participant.
Yeah, and one of our, your reports continue to fly off our shelves, so to speak. But now you're the dean of the Glenn College of Public Affairs at the Ohio State University, and now the executive director of the state of Ohio's Leadership Institute. Yeah. Given that background, given your academic interests, the fact that unlike most, your academic interest is really practical. I mean, It's right in there. What are some of the key leadership skills and competencies needed, given your background, needed by folks to succeed in the public sector? And how do these skills differ, say, from those found in the private sector?
Yeah. So one school of thought is there is no difference, right? I mean, that some of the skills that we need in the public sector are the same that we need in the private. But I think there are some important contextual differences that enhance certain kinds of skills that are needed in the public sector. It's always the case that in any leadership role, you're balancing multiple interests. Those interests there's a multiplicity of those interests in the public sector, particularly in a political environment. So those people who are moving into elected leadership roles have to get really flexible and agile at weighing different views and values, whether it's maybe we're in a moment where people are concerned about cost efficiencies, but others were concerned about equity. And usually it's both. And what are the trade-offs between those? Interestingly, in light of what we were talking about earlier, I think we're in an era where people see those as oppositional. Right? And we know from years in the public sector that the trick of being an effective leader is finding that middle ground, not just between positions, but between values. What are the trade-offs between efficiency and equity? Those are magnified in the public sector, and we need leaders who are comfortable making those. First off, identifying those value trade-offs, and then figuring out how to balance them. Senator Glenn had many parts of his career. He was a military war hero. He was, first in space as an American to orbit the Earth. But he was also an elected official, and he took great pride in that role as an elected official. And one of the things that he often reflected on at the tail end of his life, sadly, when he just passed away a year and a half ago, was that he was a Democrat at heart, but he was an Ohioan at heart. And having to navigate what are the interests of the Democratic Party versus what are the interests of the state of Ohio, that's not something that comes easily to everyone, right? And I think in a corporate environment, we narrow. We think, who are my shareholders? Who are my clients? Who are my customers? And I'm going to focus like a laser beam on those people. Effective public leaders have to think more broadly about who their clients, constituents, stakeholders are.
So I was remiss in not asking you initially, what would you envision, or what do you have as your key strategic priorities for, say, the next year?
Yeah. Well, we're still in our startup phase. And so, number one, you got to build the right team, as we know from many of the lessons that you guys share in the IBM Center. So we're hiring staff and putting together teams of experts to build content and think about how to deliver this knowledge. So that's step one. Step two is to beta test some of the content and the ways that we deliver. So I mentioned earlier the first Leadership Academy cohort will go through this summer, and they will be a test case for us, and we'll learn some lessons from them. And one of the things I think we do well in universities, even though we sometimes get criticized for being reactionary and ossified, we're committed to learning, and we want to make improvements. So we'll run a cohort this summer. We'll learn from that, and then make improvements and roll out better versions. So that's step two, is to start that process of putting some content out there, listening to those who would use it or participate in it, and then making improvements to it. Those are our two big goals this year.
Be sure to join me next time on the Business of Government Hour TV for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government effectiveness. Until then, it's businessofgovernment.org.